Commission. So we welcome you folks coming in. Surprise, Marielle? No, we're good. So a lot of interest in our presentation tonight and in the whole report and effort that we're doing. So we appreciate Tom coming up from Camoin. He's the director of research with Camoin, and so he's really led the team effort on this project, very important project, and it's really what we just started it in November.
Yeah,
so
November. Yeah.
Also, folks who have contributed to this process: Emily Raby, our county planner; Laura Graziano, our assistant county planner and GIS whiz. So they've really had a hand in making the document really strong and accurate and all kinds of good things with good ideas. So just a brief introduction. Affordable housing has been a challenge for us for decades. Just in the last maybe 10 years or so, we've had some of our larger towns do their comp plans, like Boothbay Harbor, Boothbay, Damascotta. And then a couple of years after that, Somerville, Westport, rural towns did the comp plans. And everyone's identified housing as a need, and they've developed strategies. And there we are. And then, so we pay attention to a few of the trends, and then the world continues to change. And so maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the short-term rental, the Airbnb really popped up as a growing trend, and then COVID, lovely COVID. But in the midst of COVID, we started a strategic planning process. So we did this for several months. I don't remember how long it actually took, but it was probably a good part of a year as we got it all together and presented it to the county. So we adopted a 5-year strategic plan in about 2 years ago, now. And we identified 6 priority areas, one of which was housing. No surprise there. And then we drilled down a little deeper to identify some action areas, and a top one, because we only had some general sense of trends, a few years earlier, was really the need to conduct a housing assessment. We wanted to get broader and deeper in terms of all the details. So we had a fairly detailed outline that we presented to Camoin, but we wanted to look at sales trends, income trends, ordinances, all that fun stuff, trends in projected new housing. What are the different issues from coast to inland towns that communities face? And so we wanted to make sure that our work was really addressing the entire county. And then, what were some of the factors that variably affected affordability in terms of the stretching from Somerville to Monhegan, if you will. And having identified housing as a top priority, we were able to get county funding for the study. So that's an important sort of evolution in some of the work that we've been doing, is that this is important work, it's priority work, and we were able to engage Camoin, I think beginning in November, to work with us on this. So we're super excited finally to have this done and ready to present to you and to the public. So we want to thank the county and our board. The chairperson is here, or former chairperson is here, and members are here, so that's kind of cool. But we would certainly appreciate the county commissioners and the county administrator's support of the project and this priority. So I'm not sure if some of you participated in the focus groups we had. We did some outreach work in December primarily, I think, with employers, legislators, and a variety of folks. So we appreciate your input to that. And we're so thrilled to have everybody on the Zoom screen and here tonight. But I'd like to welcome Tom Dworsky to present the sort of a really highlight of what you've accomplished so far. And again, I think we're going to eventually get to where we're talking about strategies. And then at some point when we wrap up the presentation, we'll be looking for questions and discussions with you good folks. So.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mary Ellen. Thanks everyone for being here. The fact that we have so many people here on such a lovely day tells me that housing really is an important issue here in the county. So thank you for coming. Next slide, please, Laura. So our agenda for this afternoon, I'll introduce myself and Camoin Associates, talk a little bit about what the purpose of the project was and the different tasks that we went through. We'll go through some highlights from the data. Some of you were here for our presentation back in December, so I'll kind of hit the highlights from that presentation. Won't spend too long on the data. Then we'll move into kind of the assessment of housing need. What is the housing that is needed in the county? And then we'll end with strategies, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So look forward to that component as well. Next slide, please. So for those that don't know us, Camoin Associates, we're a full-service economic development consulting firm. We're around since 1999. We work kind of nationally. We've got 25 or so full-time staff, 4 staff in Maine. I'm based in Boston, and we do a lot of work in real estate and housing analysis. On this project with me, we had a team of 4 of us, me, Jordan, who's on the Zoom call at the moment. He was our project manager and leading a lot of the report development. And then we had 2 analysts working with us as well, John Walker and Connor Allen. Next slide, please. So what was the purpose of this exercise? 4 kind of primary pieces here. First was to assess the current state of housing in the county. What are the issues? What are the challenges? Identify current and future housing needs, so actually quantifying how those challenges translate into how much housing is needed. And then moving into the development of a strategy framework, so kind of buckets of strategies and then individual strategies and tactics that the county can do. And keep in mind, this was done from the perspective of the county, and as they need to work with different partners and municipalities and so forth. And then we did some engagement and mobilization of key stakeholders. So some interviews earlier on, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a few slides. Next slide, please. So more specifically, the components, we had our kickoff back in November. On the data side of things, we looked at demographic and economic trends, then shifting into more the housing data itself. So housing inventory, housing market trends. Then onto affordability and attainability. How do the housing price points relate to what people are earning in the county, and how does that translate to affordability? Then the actual needs, quantification of number of units, and we'll get into the results of that. The county staff here helped us put together some future growth area maps as well, which kind of identify locations within the county that are suitable for kind of more intensive housing development. And then the strategy and framework. And of course, we're now at the final presentation component. And then coming out of this, the full report will be released as well once we just tune up a few more things. So you'll have access to that. Next slide, please. So just to talk a little bit more about the engagement that we did as part of this exercise, I was here during the winter and had a few different interviews and focus groups with various employers within the county, some developers and lenders that deal with housing, municipal government leaders, state and local legislators, and homelessness and housing service providers. And then we did a public session, as I mentioned earlier, in December that focused on some of the data trends. Next slide, please. So I'm going to, some of this will look a little bit familiar to those that were at the December presentation. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just want to kind of remind people of kind of the major data findings. So first, I've got 10 kind of quick findings here. So the first one is steady growth in year-round population. So Lincoln County's population is growing. It grew by a similar amount over the 2000s decade and the 2010s decade, about around 800-ish residents both of those decades. And the county grew slightly slower than the state, but about average statewide. Let's see, in terms of kind of individual communities, you all know this, Waldoboro, Wiscasset, Booth Bay are the largest. 4 municipalities actually lost population, permanent population. So Booth Bay Harbor, Edgecombe, Monhegan. Some of those might sound surprising, but this is specifically permanent population. So you have some, seasonal folks that aren't counted in these numbers, and that's why you've seen some declines there. And South Bristol and Noblesboro added the most residents over the last decade. Next, please. Second finding, the population is aging. Lincoln County is an older county. Maine is an older state. So Lincoln's an old county and an old state. The median age in the county is over 10 years older than it is in the US, almost 12 years older. The age 60 and up population expanded from 30% to 37.5% of the total county population over the last 10 years or so. The under 18 population count was down about 11% over that period. And then as a result of that, we're also seeing declining average household size. So the number of people in an average household has declined. Typically, older households tend to have fewer people in them. Next, please. So on to the third finding here. Incomes vary substantially by community. So on average, the median household income in Lincoln County is about $58,000, very close to what it is in Maine, slightly below what it is in the US. This is specifically, again, looking at the incomes of permanent resident households. And you see in the graph kind of the full range of incomes. So ranging from Waldoboro, which had the lowest median income of $43,000, up to Newcastle with $83,000. So that's, you know, essentially double Waldoboro. So big range there. Next slide, please. Lincoln County has more out commuters than in commuters. So when we're looking at the people that live and work in the county, more people are leaving Lincoln County for work than the number that are coming in. 61% of county residents work outside the county. Top destinations are Damariscotta, which is obviously in the county, but then Bath, Augusta, and Portland, number 2, 3, and 4 are all outside the county. And then you've got about 46% of folks that work in the county are coming from elsewhere. Typically, residents of the county are commuting out of the county for higher paying jobs than what are offered within the county. Kind of your major job sectors in the county are retail, healthcare, and educational services. And the top sectors of employment for residents of the county are healthcare, retail, and manufacturing. So manufacturing, you know, not a big manufacturing presence here in the county. You have some out commuting for that. Next, please. So this is a major finding here. So there was a dramatic slowdown in housing production in the 2010s decade compared to the 2000s decade. And so from 2000 to 2010, almost 2,700 new units were produced on net in the county. And then from 2010 to 2020, only 115 were produced on net. And when I say on net, I mean some units are added, some units are taken out of the stock, but on the whole inventory of housing in Lincoln County only increased by just over 100 units. So you can see that trend kind of in most every community in the graph. If you compare the blue bars to the green bars, the blue bars was the 2000s decade, and the green bars are the 2010s decade. And you can see, I think, in almost every case, just the difference there.
That's new housing?
This is just total housing units that were produced, the change in housing units that were produced. Yeah, so you can think of it as new housing units. Yeah. And this includes permanent, seasonal, vacant, all housing units. And also worth noting, so Lincoln County over the 2010s decade, the total stock increased by 0.5%, whereas in Maine it increased by 2.5%. So that's a pretty significant lag in what was created in the state, and then much or way behind the US, which increased by 6.7% over that period. Next, please. Seasonal units are a substantial share of the housing stock. This probably isn't surprising. Seasonal units made up about 3 out of every 10 units, like a full 29% of housing units in Lincoln County are seasonal, meaning they're not occupied year round. And that is quite a bit higher than the state average of 17%. It varies a lot by community. In Southport, Monhegan, South Bristol, Bremen, Booth Bay Harbor, those are all over 50% of the housing stock is seasonal. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got Wiscasset, Waldoboro, Whitefield, with a fairly nominal share of seasonal units. Next slide, please. There's a limited availability of year-round rental housing. So when you're looking at all occupied housing in Lincoln County, 79% of that is owner occupied and 21% is renter occupied. That's a lower share than the main average of 27%. Lowest share by community, Southport, Bremen, Whitefield. Highest rental share, Damascotta, Wiscasset, South Bristol, Waldoboro. So a range there. And we know, from interviews and from the data, it's very difficult to find a year-round rental in the county. Next. We know that short-term rentals impact the availability of year-round rental units. There's over 1,000 active short-term rentals in the county on platforms like Airbnb, VRBO, etc. They make up about 4% of the county housing stock. So when you look at all the number of homes in the county and you look at the number of entire home short-term rentals, it makes up 4%, which is not insignificant. And this is from a data source we use that tracks kind of short-term rentals, kind of crawls the web and pulls those listings and kind of aggregates them that way. So on average, they estimate that the typical monthly revenue generated for a monthly rental would be about $3,500 for the owner of that rental. If you compare that to what a typical rent might be for a year-round unit, it's far and away much higher. So you can see kind of the financial incentive of renting a short-term rental, even if it's for a few months out of the year, compared to a year-round rental unit. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at home price growth. So home price growth far outpaced income growth. Over the last 5 years, the median home sale price more than doubled in Lincoln County. In 2017, October 2017, it was $189,000. By October 2022, it reached nearly $400,000. And that represents an annualized growth rate, so a year-over-year growth of 16% each year over that 5-year period, compared to incomes which only grew 2.5% over that period. So you can begin to see how that's starting to create an affordability challenge. Since October, when we collected the data, prices have moderated a bit. They've kind of stopped going up, but they still remain high. The median home price is essentially 45% higher than what can be afforded by the median income family. So in a situation where a community is affordable, you want to see that the median home price is generally affordable to the median earning household in the community. You can see how imbalanced it is here. And this is not unique to Lincoln County. This is happening everywhere. And so just kind of to give a sense, so when we talk about area median income, that's kind of a measure that HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, uses for when they establish what incomes are kind of nationally. So the area median income for Lincoln County, according to HUD, is about $80,000. And a household earning that can afford a home of about $276,000. You can see that on the table below. Whereas the median price home in the county is $399,000. You need $116,000 to afford that. So it's just kind of more detail around that gap there. Next slide, please. And then the 10th kind of data fact here. 1 in 4 households in the county are cost burdened, and cost burdened, that's kind of a standard definition that's used by housing agencies. A household is considered cost burdened if they spend more than 30% of their household income on housing costs. So about 1 in 4 in the county fall into that category, and it's disproportionately renter households. Next slide, please. So now we're going to kind of shift to how that translates into what the need is for housing in the county and the different issues that this data represents. So if we think about the future and what kind of the future of Lincoln County 10 years from now, we know some of these projections. So we're estimated on net about 400 new year-round households. So the county will continue to grow in terms of number of households. 450 new jobs in the county, projecting forward the trends that are currently being experienced. 2,470 retirements, which is a full 19% of the workforce in Lincoln County. So those are resident workers. 19% of the current workforce is expected to retire in the next 10 years, which is quite a large share. As a result of that, retirement age households, which we're defining as households where the householder is at least 65 and up, those will expand from currently being about 40% of all households in the county to 45%. So the share of households that are at retirement age is growing. And then by definition, then the working age household shares is declining, and that's declining both in share and in number. So the number of working age households is expected to decline in the county, projecting forward future trends. And then we also need to factor in the need to replace older housing, so that creates additional demand for housing as well. So taken together, again, I just want to be clear, these are projections. This is not predicting the future. This is just projecting forward the trends that we're seeing now. The county has some control to change some of these things by taking steps on housing affordability creation and so forth. And we'll talk about some of those things. So, but given this future, a minimum of 1,000 new year-round housing units are going to be needed just to maintain current affordability levels. So, again, to put that into perspective, 1,000 units maybe sounds like a lot. You recall from 2010 to 2020, the county only added 115 units. The prior decade, it was 2,644 units. So it would by no means be unprecedented to add 1,000 new units to the county, right, in a decade. Next slide, please.
What defines a unit? How big?
Any size unit, just a
One
unit.
bedroom, 2 bedroom, 5.
Yep, all of those would be units. Yep.
Are accessory units also considered units?
Yep. Yeah.
Tiny homes?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Essentially, any kind of self-contained home that a family or household could live in. Kitchen, bathroom. Yep. Okay. And then so now we're talking specifically about affordable unit needs. So we know, to prevent the affordability crisis from getting worse, we need 1,000 units at a minimum. The market will take care of higher end units, right? We know that whether they're year round or seasonal, the market will create those. Those units they sell for enough that developer and investors are going to step in and build those. It's the ones below the market rate price points where there's a challenge. Without some kind of partnership with the public sector and financing in some way, those units just don't pencil out financially. So no one's gonna just build them, right? So that's what we mean by affordable rate units. And in this particular case, according to our analysis, we're using affordable rate to mean households earning up to 80% of area median income. Area median income, again, is about $80,000. So we're talking about households earning up to $65,000, right? So affordable has a lot of different meanings depending on who you ask. In this particular case, we're talking about units affordable to those earning up to $65,000 a year. And kind of based on our analysis, our kind of recommended breakdown for those units. So about 900 total units would be needed to accommodate kind of working families and older residents of limited means. Kind of the recommended breakdown: 250 owner-occupied workforce units, 250 renter-occupied workforce units, and then 400 affordable older adult units. So we know workforce units are going to be critical for the county to be able to compete for labor, right? We know that kind of based on those projections, the number of working age households is declining. And in order to kind of combat that, we need housing for workers to live in, and those workers are going to have to come from somewhere else because they're not currently in the county, right? So to backfill those retirements, those workers are going to need to come from somewhere, and if there's no housing that exists that they can afford, they're not going to come. So we can directly create workforce units, units that are affordable to the workforce and occupied by working families. And then we can also indirectly create workforce units by creating some older adult units that can then allow older adults to move from those units, from their existing units, downsize into units that might be more appropriate for them, lower maintenance, smaller, whatever it might be. And then they can be backfilled by workers. So it allows the housing market to kind of turn over. All right, next slide, please. And so getting more to kind of why create affordable housing, right? This is a very major issue for the county's economic future. So, we're hearing about labor shortages. We hear it on the national news. We know it's an issue locally here as well. Affordable housing is a major component to ensuring that we have a sufficient labor pool to fill the jobs that need to be filled here in the county. It also allows incommuters to live where they work. As Lincoln County becomes more expensive, some folks are pushed out of the county. They can't afford to live in the county more. They're commuting from farther away to come in. This allows some incommuters. Some people choose to live outside the county, but some would prefer to live in the county but can't afford it. So that is another reason. Supporting existing residents who are cost burdened. So by creating these affordable units, it offers an alternative for residents who really would like to stay in their communities, and they can do so with affordable units. For older adults, it allows older adults to age in place, meaning that might mean not mean specifically they stay in their home, but they stay in their community, right? Most older adults do prefer to age in place, based on national statistics. We hear about people retiring to other places, but it's more common the case that older adults prefer to age in place. So giving those options are important. And then getting back to attracting younger residents to put down roots, this is important, and along with the next bullet as well, kind of social cohesion and volunteerism. If you have just a lot of people commuting from other places, they're not as invested locally in the community as if they were to both live and work here. So allowing younger residents and families to put down roots is important for fostering that kind of social cohesion, volunteerism, community organizations, volunteer fire department, whatever it might be. Having people are more likely to get involved if they live here as well as work here. Also helps stem school enrollment declines. We know if you look at all the school districts combined in Lincoln County, they've declined over the last 10 years or so. So getting that kind of younger family presence will combat that to some extent. And then it prevent the affordable crisis from worsening. If nothing is done, it doesn't mean we stay where we are now. It means things just get worse and more challenging. Next slide, please. And so what are the barriers to affordability? What is creating some of the affordability problems that we're experiencing? So low availability of housing, that is, if there's not a lot of housing created, not a lot of housing available, the price goes up, right? It's kind of simple supply and demand. Lack of housing production, we saw the stats on that, right? Seasonal second home demand. So we saw, particularly for short-term rentals, it makes financial sense to do a short-term rental rather than a year-round rental. Same for, some of those are second homes and so forth. High development costs. This has been an issue kind of in the last few years, specifically along with kind of the inflation challenges that we're seeing. Construction costs really soared over these last few years, which is makes it hard to produce a housing unit that is affordable, right? The builder needs to make money on that unit. If the construction costs are going up, there's a floor that they need to charge in order to turn a profit. Otherwise, they're not going to build the unit. So that, inflation has caused that. High interest rates makes it more challenging to buy a home. So, the monthly payment that you would have seen when interest rates are low was significantly lower than it is for, the same loan size, but for at the current moment. So that means people are renting longer. That means there's more rental demand. Those units become even more scarce and so forth. Infrastructure and site limitations. So this gets to, are there sites within the county where the infrastructure needed to support a unit exists? This gets to what level of density can be supported. So, water and sewer in particular are needed to be able to support higher density developments. And building more densely allows you to offer more affordable units. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then regulatory constraints, the different rules and regulations that prevent building more densely or building in certain areas and so forth. Those can create barriers to affordability too. So we'll talk about some of the strategies to deal with some of these barriers. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the strategy framework. So knowing all of that information, the next phase of the project was to then say, all right, now what do we do about it? What can the county specifically do to make some progress on this issue? So there's 5 different buckets of strategies, and we'll go through each of them. And so just kind of generally working with municipalities to set goals, developing partnerships, aligning regulatory policies, prioritizing sites, and then implementation. So we'll go through each of these. Next slide, please. So the first one is around working with the municipalities to set goals and fosters public support. So a really important piece to kind of set the groundwork for creating affordable housing is to kind of mobilize the county and get some consensus around setting goals for affordable housing creation. How many units are we trying to create? What kind of units? Where should they be? What are the price points? Who are the target populations for those units? So that should really be kind of a short time frame kind of goal. And then and so the county can do that working with individual municipalities. Each municipality will have a role to play in kind of increasing the supply of housing in the county. And having a specific goal on paper goes a long way to kind of signal to both the public and developers and housing production that the county's serious about this, and this issue is something that we want to make progress on. So that'll involve, convening municipal decision makers, leading on educating the public about the importance of affordable housing, and then building capacity internally within the county government to be able to advance some of these strategies that we're discussing. Next one, please. So the second group of strategies is around developing partnerships. So there's a few different groups that the county would benefit from partnering with. And it's important really to engage with these partners early and use them as advisors as the county works through these different issues to remove barriers to housing. And we've already engaged some of them throughout this process through our interviews and so forth to ensure that the county's making the right decisions to move the needle on the housing issue. So the first kind of group is around engaging and establishing local and regional housing nonprofits. So we know some of those already exist in the county, and they're making efforts to move the needle on the housing situation. It might be that certain areas of the county aren't covered by certain nonprofits and so forth. So it could make sense for the county to kind of spearhead kind of the need or the creation of those kinds of things. In particular, housing trusts are a common model. There's at least one of those in the county already. And what they do generally is kind of they identify sites, acquire sites for housing production, and then they basically put together financing to allow for the creation of a housing development, affordable housing project on a particular site. So, you might see there's a few examples throughout Maine. We've worked in Kennebunkport, for example, or Mount Desert Island, where funds are raised either through grants or in some cases donations from residents of the community, where they help to kind of close the funding gap on these projects. Sometimes land is donated and so forth to make the numbers work on affordable housing development. So that's a key stakeholder in these partnerships. Engaging local and other Maine-based affordable housing developers will be key as well. Understanding, what are they looking for when they're deciding whether to do a development project or not? What are the barriers that they see for Lincoln County, and how can those be addressed? That will also be critical. And then the third group is large employers to assist with housing creation. So in some cases, large employers might be able to donate land, build housing on their land, some other kind of in-kind contributions to kind of help with this situation as well. Next one. The third one is around aligning regulatory policies. So this one is probably the most technical of the different strategies. There's a lot of different kind of programs and policies and so forth that individual municipalities can do. And so this is so the county doesn't really have a lot of direct power for most of these things. It's really in the local municipal hands to adjust ordinances and change rules and so forth that allow for some of these things to happen. But the county can lead on kind of advising what would be effective. So, there's a lot of kind of individual things here. We'll talk about growth areas specifically. And we talked a bit about kind of the importance of higher density development to ensure that, one, faster progress is made on, right? If we're just doing, a few units here and there, every unit helps, of course, but to really make a dent in that 900 affordable units, that's a lot of 2 or 3 unit projects, right? So it means, considering higher density development, and we need the infrastructure to support that. You can't create a 20 unit apartment development in a place that doesn't have sewer and water. So that's what we mean by growth areas. Those growth areas, and we'll show a map later on. Those are areas that already have the sewer and water infrastructure to be able to support that development. So it may be, in terms of policies, expanding local growth areas might make sense through strategic rezoning. Certain areas that maybe have access to sewer and water, but aren't zoned appropriately for denser, more intensive affordable housing. Those should be considered for rezoning. Relatedly, upzoning growth areas to allow for higher density housing development might make sense. Kind of just in terms of kind of permitting fees, streamlining approvals processes, all the kind of administrative stuff to get housing projects through the finish line. We want to make that as easy as possible for developments that we want to happen. So kind of reducing any kind of burdens on the potential applicants of the projects. Of course, that doesn't mean just let anyone build anything anywhere, but to the extent that it makes sense to streamline some of these processes, that would be useful. The next one is around TIF. That might not be a familiar term to some people. That stands for tax increment financing. It's a kind of municipal financing tool that's used throughout Maine in different areas. So what that does is essentially it's the future tax revenues that could be produced by a housing project. Those revenues would be used to fund some of the project or create infrastructure needed to support that project. So there's different ways that TIF can be used there as a funding source to make some of these things happen. Accessory dwelling units, encouraging accessory dwelling units is a way to create kind of typically smaller housing units, and by very nature of them being smaller, they're a bit more affordable, kind of that naturally occurring affordable variety of housing. That helps reducing parking minimums. It's not a major problem here, but it could be in select cases. And then the last one there is implementing short-term rental regulation. So that one's probably going to be a bit controversial. And some communities have done that throughout Maine, where they're regulating what kind of units can be converted, who has to own the unit in order for it to be used as a short-term rental. And there's a lot of details around that, but basically, for the purpose of this presentation, the bottom line is that's something that probably needs to be visited in certain communities where short-term rentals are a very significant portion of the housing stock. Next one, please. So prioritizing sites. For housing to happen, it needs to be located somewhere, and it needs a site. And getting a site as shovel-ready as possible really helps kind of expedite the development of larger scale housing. And so when we say shovel readiness, that means a site that has access to infrastructure, sewer and water, that's appropriately zoned, it's in a location that makes sense. And so what the county can do for this particular strategy is to kind of start compiling an inventory of prioritized sites throughout the county where sizable development can take place. And when I say sizable, we're talking about, at least 10, 20, maybe even more units where you can do a sizable housing project to really make a dent in that, the number of units that's needed. So by compiling that list, you've now got specific locations that you can now shop around to housing developers and say, hey, we've got the site, it's ready to go. We just need someone to build on it, rather than a developer coming, maybe they're interested, they live locally in Lincoln County, they want to do something to build affordable housing, but they might have to start from square one where there isn't even a known site. So, it just expedites the whole process. And so that would involve removing regulatory barriers, addressing infrastructure gaps, and then even potentially the county could acquire sites with housing development potential. And so that would prevent those sites from being used for other uses that might make more sense financially, like market rate housing. And a perfect affordable housing site could be a missed opportunity if that site is sold to someone that wants to do something else with it. So that's another thing that the county or municipalities could consider as well. And then the last strategy, next slide please, is around implementing projects. So again, this is going to be working with public-private partnerships with developers to get these projects actually done. This is obviously kind of the last step in the bucket, actual building of the project. So, working with those developers to make sure they have the funding they need and so forth to get those projects built. And then also importantly is around ensuring that affordable units that are created remain affordable into the future. And sometimes depending on different programs, they have kind of length of time that they're required to be affordable, but after that they can just be converted to market rate units. So avoiding that, it helps to make sure for the long term that you have these affordable units. Existing developments in the county, there are some existing affordable housing developments in the county. Learning when those might be kind of expiring in terms of their affordable length of time would be good to know, and then the county can kind of play a role in potentially extending that or making sure they change hands to someone that wants to do that with them and so forth. So that's kind of the strategies. And then just kind of, we're almost wrapped up here. The next slide here is now we're getting into where exactly we're talking about within the county. So we worked with county staff here to do kind of a GIS analysis We looked at a mile buffer around public sewer and water utilities, and you see kind of the colored yellow, green areas on the map here. And those are the areas within the county that are within a mile of public sewer and water utilities. And so when we're talking about higher density developments that need infrastructure, these are the most logical places to put them because that infrastructure already exists in the county. That's not to say that no housing should be built outside of these areas, but when we're talking about larger scale projects, this is most likely where they're going to go. On the table on the right there, and as part of our analysis, we kind of allocated the projected unit need by municipality, and that the formula for this kind of involved looking at the areas that did have access to sewer and water, and then kind of otherwise allocating based on current population of the different municipalities. So this is kind of the recommended number of units that each municipality should try to create in terms of affordable units within their borders somewhere. So you can see, some of the larger ones, Waldeboro, Wiscasset, those each have over 100 units. Those different nodes within the county, I know the map's a little bit hard to see, but we're looking at on the southern part of the map there, Booth Bay and Booth Bay Harbor. In the west, we've got Wiscasset. In the middle, we've got Damascotta and Newcastle, and then in the east we've got Waldeboro. So those are kind of the nodes that we're talking about here. And I think Maryland's got some
Laura's created a
larger
scale map that you can look at.
scale maps. And you'll see on the map there, the yellow areas are the areas that are kind of identified or they're more growth areas, whereas the green areas are rural or they have more kind of restricted zoning. So specifically the yellow areas are kind of based on current zoning where you're most likely going to put larger scale residential. Anything to add on that, on the mapping?
I don't think necessarily. I'm captured it.
Okay. Great. And then, so outside of those areas, other communities can seek to accommodate smaller scale development. So single family units, duplexes, accessory dwelling units, those can all still be built in places that don't have sewer and water, public sewer and water infrastructure. Other ways of accommodating affordable housing, dividing larger single family units into a few multi-unit dwellings, converting seasonal occupied units to year-round units, rehabilitating existing vacant housing units that maybe are substandard, not occupied, renovating them so that they are occupiable. So there's different things that can be done other than building large projects, but all of those things need to be done. It's not or, it's and. And then just some final takeaways on the last slide here. So the workforce housing shortage really is an existential threat to the county's economy. This is a major issue. If we think the labor shortage is bad now, without doing anything, as we saw, like the number of retirement age housing units is just going to grow in the share of total units in the county. So, without creating workforce housing, the labor force is going to be smaller in 10 years than it is today. So no action means affordability worsens. You got fewer year-round housing units, your labor pool will shrink, and your population will age more rapidly. Lincoln County is not unique in this challenge. I just want to make that clear. It's happening, it's playing out in communities across the nation. But each community kind of has to play its role in doing what they can to help address the issue. Sizable development projects are really needed to move the needle. 30, if you could do a 30 unit development, a 50 unit development, that would go a long way to make some progress on this in the next few years. All municipalities have a role to play, even those that don't have the infrastructure to support those larger developments. And then, of course, partnerships are going to be critical for implementation. So that's all I've got for presentation, and now we can shift to a Q&A.
It was excellent, excellent. A lot of detail covered, so.
That's affordable.
We have a question from the, we have a question from the back.
Hi, I'm Walker, Executive Director at Habitat for Humanity, Seven Rivers, Maine. We serve this county as well as Saginaw County, Greater Brunswick, and Greater Hartswell. And it was really nice to see this information presented. It's very validating. We believe pretty much everything that you put out here. We've known it for a long time. We just built 2 houses in Wiscasset. We're set to build 2 houses in Booth Bay. I just built one in Booth Bay Harbor in the last couple of years here. 2 barriers that I didn't see in the barrier list would be mill rate, for example. To have someone who makes 80% AMI to, let's say, 40% AMI. We won't even talk about those below 40% AMI. A small 1,000 square foot house in Wiscasset at a 20 mill rate is going to be, with current values of houses, even for a 1,000 square foot base, everything, that's over $5,000 a year. So what percentage of your income is going for your taxes alone? Quite a bit. So a regulatory solution that I think I would advocate to be entered into this presentation would be thinking about the mill rate on affordable housing units specifically. Or thinking about maybe we don't use 100% of the market value of the house, and we have a different value that is assessed through the town. You know, I feel like that's a major issue. Like, and also just to talk up Habitat, why I have the mics here. It's not just building houses. We've also fixed and repaired hundreds of houses in this community so that older folks can thrive in place, and so that people on a fixed income can thrive in place. And the idea of having the houses stay at a high value is, you know, important too, instead of everything being run down because people cannot afford to fix up their houses and thrive in place, whether they're older or are just struggling to have ends meet. And I agree 100% with the workforce thing and the existential threat. That's why we build workforce housing. And we would definitely be a partner interested in working with the county, as we're doing with Brunswick and other places throughout the state.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Yeah, no, that's a great comment about the mill rate. Yeah.
The other barrier, though, is NIMBYism. And that has been, I've seen that firsthand severely, thinking, oh, you're putting a poor, uneducated person in my neighborhood. I don't like that one bit.
So we have, hold on, we have a question on Zoom.
Yeah,
Wendy-
I'll let you guys.
Okay. Wendy, we see your hands up. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks very much for this great study. Camoin's done a wonderful job, and I found the data very interesting. I have one question and one observation in question. One, the explosive growth rate of South Bristol of plus 26%, I found astonishing. And I wonder if you have any insights of why that was such a significant outlier. And the second observation that I didn't see in the recommendations was you outlined work at the county level and kind of at the municipal level. But many of us who've worked on this issue know that all of us in Lincoln County and individual towns, this is not something we can work on in isolation. For example, the map of the growth areas kind of show where the cheapest housing can be built because the infrastructure is in place, which means that towns should be smart and collaborate on housing because it's going to benefit everyone in all of their communities. And I didn't see much in your recommendations about how we get towns to work together for common goals in housing. Some towns may have more land, other towns may have more resources. Can you speak about that just a bit, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a role that the county can really play in kind of bringing together the different municipalities to the same table and talk through, what makes sense to do where and how they can all kind of chip in based on the assets that they have. So that, that's certainly an important point. As we kind of said, the county doesn't have a lot of leverage to really make a lot of this stuff happen on their own. It's going to be up to the municipalities to decide that. And, by setting the goals, it kind of goes back to the first bucket of strategies there. The goals, if a county-wide goal is needed, but I think individual municipal goals, to the extent that, all the different municipalities can collaborate on that effort to set goals and agree to goals for the municipality, I think will go a long way there too. And then to answer the question about South Bristol, in percentage terms, that was a large amount of growth, 26%. In terms of actual population, they added 235 people to a town that was 892. So I don't know specifically if there was a development that occurred there. Or I don't know if anyone at the table does, but no, we didn't look at that specifically.
Other than I think they have a very low mill rate.
So we have another hand up on Zoom from Rachel Collimore. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, yeah. So I'm fascinated by this data, but I'm a little worried about some of the things like the nuances of this that it might not address. And I'm thinking, as a resident of Damariscotta, we have a school that's pretty much at capacity, which is good, almost maybe over capacity. And thinking about where our public utilities run, right? We have water in some areas, sewer in some areas, not overlapping in others. And thinking about how this really is a county-wide collaborative issue, but there are some issues that are really specific to the towns. And I worry looking at Damariscotta's, I don't want to make this all about Damariscotta, so I apologize, bear with me. Damariscotta's median income and our mill rate, which isn't as high as Wiscasset, but it's still high, and thinking about how we can keep our school at capacity while not creating too much of an infrastructure transportation problem, right? We're going to expand onto some of these back roads. Then we have another cost associated with needing to widen a road or worrying about public safety. And so I really just want to draw attention to the fact that, or the reality that this data is great, but there are a lot of nuances that it's really not capturing. There's a lot of work to be done. Thinking about all of these detrimental externalities that could happen when we start to expand housing in some areas and not in others. And thinking about what the projections are versus building the kind of housing that might attract the kind of population that we need in order to maintain, budget integrity as far as all of these other costs go when we're operating our towns.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that comment. That's absolutely true. All of these, any housing development's going to go through, the existing processes that all your municipalities have to approve them or not approve them, and all of those impacts should be considered as part of this. So, we're by no means saying kind of bypass all of those existing things that are in place. But, at the same time, housing needs to be created, and those things are going to have to be addressed, whether it's, adding capacity and who pays for it. It's always the question, right? But at the end of the day, if every municipality is saying we don't have, the capacity to do this, then nothing's going to happen. So thank you for the comment.
We have a couple here. We'll go with Mel and then Adam. Is that right, Adam?
Yeah.
Okay.
Two quick items. I didn't hear any mention of mobile home parks. Unbeloved, cheap compared with most alternatives. Transition mechanism, perhaps, but it may need to be part of the mix if we're going to be able to fund this thing. And the other item is the capacity of water and sewer systems as you start to build out? You know, what is the age? What are the impediments? Water level in at least some of the cases.
Yeah, on the mobile home park issue, in the full study, we have a little bit about mobile homes. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, that's a valid point. It could be part of the solution there. On the, go ahead.
No, we have at least two mobile home parks that are owned by the people that live there, right? One in Waldeboro and one in Bristol, I think. So, I mean, that's another kind of naturally occurring
Right.
modest rent situation if we promote that kind of ownership.
And on the utility capacity issue,
We talked.
yeah, do you want to?
I can talk to
Yeah.
that. So we actually, prior to releasing this report tonight, we talked to all the utility districts. And while they were quick to caveat that they wouldn't necessarily pay for the water line or sewer line expansion, that would be up to the developer, they can handle this increased capacity. So we sent them both the map as well as the chart that Tom had with the unit distribution between towns, and there was no concerns.
Okay, so I had a, yeah.
I have two questions. One, the decades you were looking at, obviously, we're now 25% through the next decade. I'm curious, in that 1,000 number range, unit range that you were looking at, I think I know the answer, but like, how is that trending? Yeah, the second question is, with the older population that we have in this county, as those people pass on, how does that house stock, like, how are you analyzing that at all? Like, is it passed on to the next kin or?
Yeah, so yeah, both good questions. In the report, there is information on building permits that will get to recent building permits by municipality that have been issued before. Offhand, I'm not sure, but there is a nice table in the report that has that specifically, like the last few years or so. So that'll be in there. And then, yeah, on, there's all kinds of situations how homes get passed on, to different folks. I think, we don't have any specific data on a breakdown as to, what share gets passed on to next of kin versus gets sold and so forth. But, yeah, those homes obviously are still part of the housing stock and can be passed on to a workforce family as well. So, yeah, that's, obviously important, kind of the life cycle of a housing unit.
We have a question on Zoom from Walt. Walt, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, first of all, for an excellent presentation. It put a lot of things in perspective. But perhaps I'm missing something or misinterpreting something. It appears that 3 of the factors that appear to be major justifications for LD 2003 have only low to medium impact on housing, and I'm referring to reducing or removing planning permitting, encouraging accessory dwelling units, and streamlining the application process. How does that square with the emphasis on LD 2003? There seems to be a disconnect there.
Emily?
So I think when we're looking at the county overall, and I don't want to speak as if I'm an expert on LD 2003. I mean, I've been trying to decipher it for a lot of communities. I think there is an impact there. It will make a dent, but when we're talking about needing 900 more units, that's just one piece of the puzzle. And so I think the part of if we look at LD 2003 in kind of 3 parts, there's the affordable density bonus, the additional dwelling units, and then the accessory dwelling unit piece. And I think for these bigger projects, the ones that Tom kind of described at like 20 or more units, that affordability density bonus piece that is in LD 2003 is going to come into play and hopefully will make a big impact. Because it allows that if you're in a designated growth area or you're connected to sewer and water, that you can have that 2.5 times the density that is, of base density in that municipality. So I think that's kind of going to be one of those that makes a bit bigger of an impact. But when we're looking, at 900 units, the ADU piece and the additional dwelling piece that are in LD 2003, it's going to chip away at that 900 number, but it's not going to get us there faster. So I'm not going to speak for Camoin in saying that that's probably why it's more medium rated, but that would be my guess.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Go ahead.
Walt, did you want to say anything else?
No, thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, I think Chris Doherty had a question.
Yes, please, Christopher Doherty, I'm from Newcastle, residential building contractor.
Alrighty.
I wonder if you could point to a community where these strategies have been implemented and there is a success story. In other words, they solved the problem.
Well, no one solved the problem, that's for sure, but it's a matter of chipping away at it, right? So it's creating more units and, affordable housing, it's been an issue longer in places like southern Maine, more urban areas, and now it's spreading to other places, right? So communities that have been dealing with this issue for a lot longer, or at least kind of making it a strategic priority for a lot longer, have been able to create a lot of affordable housing unit projects in their communities and add to the housing stock. So, there's financing tools available to do that. I think the biggest barrier in a lot of those places is the NIMBYism that was brought up. People not wanting that housing near them, but, it's certainly, people are making progress at it. Every additional affordable housing unit helps.
I think of the development I see next to the former Naval Air Station there in Brunswick. That's not Lincoln County, I know, but they're putting up like 5 of these buildings that must have 24, 36 units in each of them. So, I mean, who did that, do you know?
I don't know the exact developer, no.
Yeah.
And I believe Brunswick has what's called an inclusionary zoning policy, which requires a certain percentage of new housing units are affordable. So I think that particular project has a component of affordable, but it's not an entirely affordable project.
Tom, did you have a question? Sorry, Tom.
Yes, Tom Churchill from Booth Bay Harbor. Excellent report, lots of really good information in there that I think we can take back to our communities and use as fuel to get things moving. Question is, when can we get a copy of the report?
I'll let
So
Mariel
we're gonna
answer
be,
that.
did you say you wanted to make any final?
We're good.
We're
If you
good.
have
So
any
we're
other
gonna
changes, yeah.
be putting this on our website and distributing it to people tomorrow.
Okay, online tomorrow?
Yeah.
From the,
Yeah,
Yeah.
we've had a lot of people by Zoom ask, so I've been saying that we'll send out an email to let everyone know when it's live on our website, including, the slide deck that Tom had tonight, the recording of the meeting, as well as the full report.
terrific,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Pat,
I might have missed something because.
well, there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on.
Quite working well. But what kind of, since this is a statewide, I mean, it's a nationwide problem, we know. But since it's a statewide problem, what kind of support do we have from the state as far as, helping with solutions in communities?
Yeah, so Maine Housing has been quite active in that. So, specifically funding, the state's going to play a role in the different funding sources. They kind of oversee the low-income housing tax credit program, LIHTC, and doling out those kind of tax credits that help produce those kinds of projects. They have their, like LD 2003 is one of their efforts that they're using to kind of help move the needle on the situation. But in the back of the report, there's kind of a whole list of different funding sources, and some of those are state level sources that can be leveraged as well.
We have Jen Merritt on Zoom with her hand up. Jen, you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hi, sorry. Okay. So you mentioned in the beginning that $65,000 a year income up to that is considered affordable as it's an 80% of the AMI. And then the gentleman from Habitat for Humanity was talking about 40% of AMI. Is that around, what's 40% of AMI perhaps?
Let me calculate it for you.
And the reason I'm asking is that we have to be careful when we're talking about people who make, say, $40,000 to $65,000 a year, And they're the ones that are qualifying for this type of affordable. We have to be careful when we're speaking publicly about defining what we mean is affordable, so that people don't get the wrong idea. $65,000 a year is fairly high in Waldoboro. That's very interesting to me. And so when we're talking about creating affordable housing, it's a different thing than what people thought before. Very different. And when we're talking about people who've been offered jobs at the Miles Hospital and at the lab, the Bigelow Labs and so forth, who literally can't find housing that's within a commutable distance for them that they can afford, and those are decent jobs. Those are very good jobs. I think that's very important that when any of us are talking about this in our communities, that we're very, very clear that what we're talking about is normal people, many in our communities who people would not consider to be needy, cannot afford to buy a home or downsize or be a new home buyer to get into. I mean, it's got to be clear when we talk about it, and not just blithely talking about affordable housing when people may not keep that new definition in their mind when they're listening. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. You know, in the report, there's plenty of stats around that. I think 40%. What do we have in here? Yeah. Yeah, so like 30% of AMI is, or no, the question was 40. Well, I guess it's kind of right in the middle. 40% of AMI would probably be around 35,000-ish. So, you know, 35 to 65,000 is kind of
And think about the rates of pay in the county, you know, and what businesses can afford to pay, and definitely $35,000 is not considered poor here, but it's, you know, it's maybe considered, I mean, $15 an hour. I mean, even if you get to $20 an hour, you're about 40,000 a year. I mean, we're in a tricky place, is all.
Yeah, and we do recognize that the definition of affordable housing has been changing, and that people putting these dollars out there, it really sensitizes people to, oh, exactly what are you talking about? So I think we do, that's a good point, Jen. So Adam's got a question.
Yeah, Adam from Habitat for Humanity again. The AMI numbers just came out for 2023, and I was using the 40% to talk more about the 40 to 80% of what you're typically talking about in these conversations.
Yep.
We don't really talk about the below 40%. That's a whole other narrative.
Yep.
And it's also based on how many people are in the household. So like the family of 4 is usually what the number is. So that 68,150 a year, that's 80% AMI for Lincoln County family of 4. An individual, which a lot of times is an older person living at home, that 80% AMI is 47,750. So imagine buying a house, either you're trying to find something affordable because you can't be in the big house that you're in because you're getting close to retirement. You've got to make at least 47,750 to be at that 80% AMI. You know, that's the max that can go. And a lot of people making almost 50 grand a year do not think of themselves as struggling, but in reality with housing, they 100% are. It is so difficult, even at 80% AMI, for any of this housing, even a house that Habitat for Humanity builds, where so much of it is donated in materials and labor, that 80% is really difficult to get to, both because of the taxes and because of the interest rate, some of the other barriers that were presented in this piece. Like, there's no way around it. Family of 4, 68 grand a year is working poor. That's what that is.
Do we have any other questions from Zoom or in the room? Mr. Tonka?
Thank you. Mike Tomko, Booth Bay Harbor. The component that matches with housing is economic development and jobs. Are there strategies that you've come across or that you've uncovered to combat the seasonal component that towns like Tom and mine face? We have businesses that are only operating for a short window, and then the rentals that fill the need for that short window, and then we're dark for those remaining 6 or more months. How do we encourage businesses, jobs, development to be able to push that shoulder season and grow the demand for the workers, which is then going to have the demand or the income for the development of the units? It's almost like a vicious circle or a catch-22.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, if you talk to any of these kind of seasonal businesses, they'll tell you labor availability is probably their number one challenge, like getting the people that they need to run their business. So, then when you talk about expanding the season, there's all kinds of considerations with that. But, expanding the shoulder season is definitely possible. Like it seems like it's being done already kind of naturally, like, since we do a lot of work in Maine, and even, the 5 or 10 years I've been doing this, the shoulder season in Maine seems like it's expanded quite a bit. I think, how that relates to housing is, having seasonal worker housing also puts a strain on year-round housing. So, for some parts of the year, you can charge a lot higher rent for your housing. So it might make sense to keep it dark the rest of the year from the perspective of the person that owns it, because you'll make more money just charging for seasonal workers over the summer than you would a year-round worker. And then, maybe, a year-round worker could live in it just during the winter months, but that doesn't help, where are they going to go in the summer? So I'm not sure that really answers your question, but, it's a hard problem. There's no easy solutions. Seasonal worker housing is a potential solution. Some communities have done dormitory type housing for seasonal workers so that it doesn't take away from kind of a traditional year-round unit. So, there's different things that seasonal communities have done to kind of deal with that issue, and kind of support the local economy and the tourism component that's so important.
Our community has seen fit to take year-round housing and turn it into employment or housing for seasonal workers,
right,
which works against the concept of year-round housing.
Right.
For example, look at the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. First year they expected 3,500 and they got 36,000. And this year, I believe it was well over 100,000 with the gardens opening up. And there's a direct impact on the economy. You're seeing that shoulder season in mid-November to the end of the year with the volume of people coming down, and yet we don't see hotels staying open, bed and breakfasts staying open. We don't see more restaurants that are open. We don't see an influx of demand for food trucks and other alternative pop-up things. So there's an effort, but not the reaction that I think that we were expecting.
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to the individual business, and I'm sure they're running those numbers, and at some point, it doesn't make sense for them to stay open after a certain point, right? When they're looking at how many customers they're going to have and how much they have to pay their workers to do that equation. So yeah, I mean, there's nothing you can really do about the underlying economics of the individual business. But maybe some business owners have not considered it, and making a concerted effort to say, hey, let's try to stay open longer and try to understand what the barriers are from preventing that from happening might be worth doing, from economic development strategy.
Or development in other areas that aren't related to seasonality.
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, I don't want to take too much, put too much focus on Booth Bay Harbor necessarily, but coming out of the Joint Economic Development Committee process that you had a few years ago after you guys did the comp plan, there was an emphasis on extending the season. And I think you've done that in a couple different ways, but then we've run into COVID and some other trends that we're seeing right now. So I think whether there's an interest in the town to focus again on that, involve the chamber and some of the larger employers down there to really look at that opportunity for extending the season in different ways, but by building up different kind of industries, different kind of businesses that relate to what you're doing now, whether it's in fisheries, tourism, in the gardens. There's offshoots of a lot of the businesses they have down there that could be developed, but we haven't really, I don't know whether the town's taken a look at that lately. But just to a point, I'm sorry, Steve, go ahead.
No, I was on to a new subject, so happy to.
Oh, well, so just a quick point. I just wanted to kind of circle back to a question that Wendy had. So Wendy, this is an opportunity for the county, this planning office and our county commissioner colleagues to really dive into housing. What is our role? What is our future role? Is it one role? Is it two roles? And so in one sense, we're going to be looking at this in a lot of detail in the next month or so to understand, the priority for our actions here as a staff, and then again, building the partnerships that Tom alluded to. So I think this is a great opportunity, not I don't want to call it just exactly a kick in the pants, but really it is for us to say, okay, now what's the county's role, which counties don't have a role in housing according to the state constitution probably, but I think because of the work that we do in the commitment that the county has had to this issue, I'm interested to see what we'll choose to prioritize here. So that's my little message there, Steve. So sorry.
No, that's great.
I think Wendy was just going to quickly. Wendy, did you want to just quickly comment on that?
Well, thank you, Mary Ellen. And I do want to say the slide that you showed of the rationale for why we need to do this, I think the data is really compelling, but most people in the town are not data geeks.
Mm-hmm.
So the slide that you all presented on the rationale for why we need to do this, that it is the existential threat to our economy and our communities, that was a very, very powerful part of the presentation that I think needs to be emphasized as you go into these discussions, that this is not just about, finding a couple houses. This is the threat to the future of our communities. And I thought you laid out the reasons quite broadly why we need to think about this as a real kind of hair on fire discussion.
Yes.
Yeah, I really compliment you on laying that out. I'll be talking about that and sharing it with people in my own community and region. So thanks for that. Very compelling.
Thanks. Steve.
Great. So Stephen Huffnagel, Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust. We operate throughout the Pemaquid Peninsula and sort of the eastern half of the Booth Bay Peninsula. And first of all, wonderful report, and really appreciated the analysis at the county level. It makes so much sense to look at it as a county issue because of the way that people work together, and also as we're thinking about development. So I've been very impressed by the level of support in Damerscott. I live in Damerscott, so also a different hat as well. But for new projects that we've been doing, the most recent project, everyone who was there was to support it. I got up as head of the Conservation Trust and could see that there was some worry, like, is he going to oppose it? And we said, no, we're very much in support of this because good development in the right places is addressing the need. Wanted to ask about roles that Conservation Trust could play in the land banking side of it. We've acquired some new properties where we've made very short and not put restrictions on ahead of time, because 20 acres close to infrastructure paired with another 30 further afield, maybe a wildlife corridor over here, but developable over there, means there's a chance to encourage the development on the 20 acres. Have you seen other examples of that, or are there ways that we could help in the conservation world as we're thinking about the broader need of the community?
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because that is not what you always hear from, land trusts and those, kind of organizations. One of the next tasks for the county is to start inventorying sites. So I think it would definitely be in their interest to connect with you, and if there's certain sites you have in mind that you think make sense, they should definitely be on the list for consideration.
One more question is pooled septic or and joint septic. Are there opportunities in that realm, or is it still too cost prohibitive? Or kind of smaller sewer systems? Like I think about Tamascata Mills has its own little sewage system. Are there other opportunities for that? So you could get, a couple hundred houses in a little hamlet of Bristol, whether it's over in Round Pond or New Harbor, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. We didn't look at that specifically, but it's certainly an interesting thought.
Yeah, I think right now it's kind of more of a case by case basis for some developers to see if they can financially make it work with like a small individualized like sewage treatment plant on the site versus doing individual septics for each unit or each building. But really it's up to the developer at this stage in time.
I think that's a really good point. Habitat for Humanity has worked directly with land trusts in the past in this area, and it's been a pretty interesting, viable solution. I think some of the ideas around a cistern, shared sump pump, and other ways that you can make a somewhat viable land become viable land to work on are all things to consider. I would just strongly recommend to take a look at what Brunswick is doing. They recently put down a moratorium. At X amount have to be affordable housing units. Nothing else can be built unless you are building X amount as affordable. And they were able to go after some, national money and county money that helped them set up a housing fund through their housing committee. And that housing fund grew from $500,000 to $1 million like overnight. And so those funds are available only for affordable housing solutions. That's attractive for folks like Habitat and other groups who have the means to come together to do something. And it's a way to attract those big employers too, because we can see now from Freeport to Bath, you have a real corridor here that needs workforce housing. And Lincoln County is not really that far away from that corridor. And so there's a lot of energy and effort and focus on how do we make and bring the workforce housing that we need. And I think the Booth Bay Peninsula and Route 1 in general, where all of these, opportunity zones are, makes a lot of sense to look at not just what the county can do, but what your neighbors are doing in a corridor that's getting a lot of attention.
So we have two hands up on Zoom. I think Brittany, I saw yours first, and then Rachel, you can go next.
Hi, my name is Brittany Gill. I work for the local nonprofit CHIP, and we do home repairs. And just really great both discussion, and thank you so much for the work that you've done in preparing this study and taking the time to highlight these important issues. A lot of thoughts and on my mind, but one question that comes up, you said in this past decade, we built a little over 100 houses, but the decade before that was 2000, and we're talking about 900, which made that seem doable. What happened during that decade that made 2000 homes or units doable? Is there something there?
I don't know. I don't have any.
Which decade?
The 2000s, why there was such a building boom in the 2000s.
Well, in 2012, for Habitat, we could build a house for $90,000. Now to build the same house, it's $225,000. It's a 165% increase in 10 years. And that's just the materials and the professional labor that we can't do. 165% increase in 10 years.
So
it was also, nationally in that period, it was the housing boom, right? Like leading up to the housing crisis in 2008, there was a lot of construction that was happening nationally too, as for some nationwide context.
Yeah, I'd like to see that broken down over that 10 years, straight line or from preloaded to before 2007. Just be curious.
Thanks, Brittany. Rachel, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I guess it's really more of a comment, and but thinking about what Stephen was saying, and you know, and how conservation trusts really play a pivotal role in, you know, maintaining the feel of a community and, you know, and keeping some of that rural that really makes us feel like, you know, we're home, right? And then also thinking about Brunswick and thinking about like Two Echoes, right? Which is a lovely little community. They have the co-housing and they have this, you know, area set aside that can't be developed, and thinking about that. And also White Birch's mobile home park in Damariscotta has town water, but they don't have town sewer, but they have larger septic systems that feed multiple units, and thinking about ways to think creatively with the land that we have. And some of that's not always buildable, right? Like I'm thinking about Damariscotta, where we have so much, you know, we have a lot of swamp like out behind me, and thinking about how we can make these pockets of dense housing and these areas around it that maintain a balance between density and this more rural feel. Because I think that's really important to a lot of us who live in this community and have been in this community for a long time, to maintain that rural-ish feel, but still want to welcome new neighbors and make space. So thinking of that.
Do we have any other questions, either in person or Zoom?
Thank you. We welcome you to stay and chat and get to know each other. So that's good. Opportunity to, because I think we've got some potential partners. Anything else, Tony? You want?
No, thank you, everyone.
I'm kind of new to the area. Is anyone from Wiscasset here that I could speak to?
I don't think so.
I'm from Wiscasset, but I'm
Well, welcome.
fairly new, making my observations post-COVID,
Okay.
getting out of it, so.
Well, that's great. That's great. Appreciate that. All right. Well, please chat amongst yourselves, or grab some cookies on the way out, or ask Tom 12 more data questions. We only have him for a few more minutes. So.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have an idea how many people?